Okay, I'm talking today with Aaron. I've had a few talks with Aaron before. We've mostly talked about Nietzsche. Um, Aaron has a deep interest in Nietzsche, but also an interest in the Bible and Christianity. And so a lot of our conversations have been around how do the two relate to each other? How reconcilable are they? Um, and so, we've had a bit of debate on this, I would say. But one of the things that Aaron mentioned at some point was that looking at the book of Job might help to bridge that gap between a Nietzschean worldview, which very briefly I would summarize as affirmation of this world to the exclusion of the transcendent, versus what Nietzsche sees as a Christian worldview, which he would see
Mhm.
as rejection or denial of this world for the sake of a transcendent world. And so, what's interesting is, Aaron, you shared a quote with me from Nietzsche that was basically Nietzsche saying, Job affirms. So that
Mhm.
suggests that he saw the book of Job in a very positive light. He saw the book of Job as being a book of affirmation, being almost perhaps a Nietzschean book, even though it's in the Bible. Um, so we're going to be talking today about the book of Job, and we're going to dive into it and sort of see what we can find there, um, particularly thinking about these issues. Um, I'll just very briefly describe the story for anyone who may not be super familiar with it. Basically, this is from the Old Testament of the Bible. It's a very strange book. It's very unlike the other books of the Bible. But basically, it tells the story of a man named Job who was very wealthy and very righteous, perhaps the most righteous person alive at the time. And God is very pleased with him for his righteousness. There is a figure in the court of God, Hasatan or Hasatan, the adversary, which later became Satan, the figure, the opposer of God. He comes to God and God says to him, "Look at Job, isn't he wonderful?" And Satan says, "Well, you kind of give him everything he needs. How wonderful would he be? How much would he praise you and fear you and do good if you took that away from him?" So God does. He takes away his family, he takes away all his wealth and his possessions, and then eventually he afflicts him with terrible skin disease. And so Job is in misery. Three friends come to him. And what happens throughout most of the book of Job is the exchange of speeches between himself and his friends. And his friends are basically trying to say, Job, somehow you're at fault for what happened to you. You must have done something wrong. And Job, with some fluctuations, maintains his innocence. He says, "No, I know that I am righteous. Um, I know that my sin has not brought this on me." And then he kind of cries out for, demands some kind of answer from God. So at the end of the book, God appears in a whirlwind and doesn't exactly in a direct way or in an explicit way answer the question that Job asked, why is this happening to me? But what he does show him is he shows him, uh, just in description, he describes the whole creation in all its splendor and wonder, all these interesting, curious, powerful, fascinating creatures that he's made. And that's pretty much it. He rebukes, to an extent, Job, and he especially rebukes his three friends. He basically says that they were wrong in what they said about God. Then we've got a happy ending. Job prays for his friends, offers a sacrifice on their behalf. God sort of forgives everyone, and they Job gets twice his wealth back, and he gets a new family, depending how you read it.
Probably the least Nietzschean part of the story,
Yes,
I guess.
exactly, exactly. And so some people aren't too happy about the happy ending. I think they think it ruins the book. But that's how the book goes. So he ends his days restored in a way, even richer, and with his righteousness vindicated. Uh, so, a strange story in a way, but we're going to delve into it and talk about it. But Aaron, what would you say attracted you to the Book of Job? Why is it significant for you?
Yeah, so thank you for all of that information already. Like, I think so much is already in there that I find interesting in itself. It's really difficult to focus on one thing. I think it's easy to point to the theodicy question that I always found interesting. Like, why would a good God allow such suffering? Like, we don't even have to go into the question of evil, but if God would allow suffering, does that make
Mm-hmm.
God evil? And it's like, it's the story perfectly acknowledges at least that reading.
Mm-hmm.
It allows for that reading because it's you can't be like the friends and say that Job is not a righteous person because we know at the start it's said out loud that he's the most righteous person and that's why he's proving it to the Satan
Mm-hmm.
indeed. So I find that very interesting to see. Okay, how do we deal with those facts? And I remember being particularly like I spoke to you offline about this. Uh, Taken aback by the movie The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick. I think it's from about 2011, uh, maybe 2010, and it's a story that is more or less a modern retelling of the Book of Job, but even that is setting some people up for disappointment because it's not a normal movie that has a normal story arc,
Mm-hmm.
etc. Though it has these similar elements that you talk about, like there is a tragedy happening in the story, and there's also this exposition of, the beginning of the cosmos. Like, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And I think the movie did it in a way that made me see the Bible book in a whole new way. Like, because I just kind of imagined um like reading the Bible book and then God saying like, oh, you weren't there at the start. It's kind of like this sort of this dry way almost of saying it. But I think what that movie did particularly well is really expose like, okay, what would that mean to fully grasp the 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 size, the magnitude of
Mm-hmm.
God's claim there, and to fully at least grasp, because according to the story, we wouldn't even be able to. That's sort of God's whole point. But
Mm-hmm.
to at least grasp our own ignorance about the matter by being so overwhelmed by just the sheer size and the amount of time. Like, even I won't spoil because but this is more or less at the start of the movie. Like, it even goes back all the way to, let's say, the dinosaurs. So
Mm-hmm.
you see all of that, and to kind of grasp that, like, yes, that all sort of took place. And
Mm-hmm.
there's something similar, obviously, in the Bible book with the
Mm-hmm.
Behemoth and the Leviathan, which we can get into. But I think that satisfied me at least for a long time. Like that and I know for some, especially if you're, let's say, a skeptical atheist listening, that will sound like a cop out. It's like, oh, God works in mysterious ways and he's like we can't comprehend it. And at the same time, I think there is something to it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also some questions that this book doesn't resolve at all. Actually, most of the questions it doesn't resolve. Like, there's no
Mm-hmm.
resolution to it, and that also keeps drawing me back into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's obviously interesting parallels with, let's say, God suffer, Job suffering so much, almost like prefiguring Christ if you read it from a Christian perspective, even though it was obviously a far older story.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways, like there's lots of different angles, and then obviously I was therefore drawn to that line in Nietzsche when I found it, more or less out of the blue, because Nietzsche, I told you about this. He barely ever talks about this. That he says, you know, art is not supposed to necessarily make one feel good. He says pessimistic art affirms, and then he says Job affirms. So he is
Mm-hmm.
squaring Job underneath pessimistic art. Then he talks about some, I think, French authors at the time who he doesn't like. So Zola, Goncourt, like it's
Mm-hmm.
like no, they're awful. And then he ends up that section with how liberating it is to read Dostoevsky.
Mm-hmm.
So there's these interesting aspects that, Dostoevsky was a Christian writer, and this is a a, a biblical book,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore combine those two aspects. I wanted to think more about the Dostoevsky part and the Book of Job part to really think about how critical is Nietzsche of the whole of Christianity or perhaps of a specific part? I
hmm
know that's a mouthful, but yeah, that's my interest in this.
No, I mean that's fantastic, and I really, for the viewers, I haven't seen Tree of Life yet, but I'm really looking forward to just based on what I've heard about it and what I've seen of the trailer. Um,
Some
so
people find it terribly pretentious. I have to warn you, but I thought it worked very well. Yeah.
I can imagine. I can imagine based on what you're saying, the cut between the scenes of creation and stuff like that. I think that would actually be really effective. But anyway, let's dive into the actual text. So, where do we want to start? What's the first line that stands out to you as important?
Hmm. Well, I think what's most relevant is that we have to start like a little bit at the start to see what's set there already and try to come to grips with it. Like I think we eventually want to obviously move towards the end where uh like I want to talk about God's whole speech. It's also
hmm
the longest recorded speech of God in the whole Bible, so I think that's noteworthy.
hmm
Uh this is also potentially, possibly the oldest Bible book, etc.
hmm hmm
Um so I think we could start just focusing on perhaps the role of Satan,
hmm
because like you already mentioned a little bit about that, like just when you were introducing it, but it's so easy to mistake the role of Satan here because we have this image of Satan, and we should sort of try to imagine what this would look like. And for the people watching, potentially you've already seen some images at this point, and if not, you'll now see the first image, which is on slide 3. And we selected some images from William Blake's illustrations of the Book of Job. It has its own perspective, so I'm not going to go too deeply into that because we're going to focus on the Book of Job today. But it gives an idea of the scale and sort of this, I think, this court that God has looking at the earth. So that will be the third slide, and that's perhaps the first thing I want to talk about because I also remember that you had some interesting ideas about Satan potentially being, like, is it fair to perhaps somewhat read him in this Christian way, or is that just confusing? And you also mentioned some, let's say, McGill Christian points. So I'm
hmm
kind of interested to hear your ideas about Satan.
Yeah, well, I think there's a real ambiguity in the role of Satan. I think even if we take this book out of its Christian context, there is an argument that actually the figure here is just purely a subordinate to God, just like all God's other servants, or the other sons of God, or the other angels, or however you want to
Mhm.
conceive it. And he's just performing a particular role.
Yeah.
He's like the prosecutor or something like that in a court. Um, and I think, there's definitely something to that, but I also feel like the Christian interpretation is also consistent with it. There is an ambiguity, there is an ambivalence with Satan where it's like, well, is he actually working for God? Is he actually working against God? Is he actually working against humans? Like,
Mhm.
what is his motivation exactly? And that brings in for me, McGill Christian point. So this is Ian McGilchrist, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, master and emissary. But just that idea of like there's something, first of all, the first thing I'll say about that, there's something particularly left hemisphere about Satan. He's critical.
Mhm.
He's critical
Yeah.
and he's trying to get beneath the surface and he's trying to analyze and he's questioning and he's saying, well, is this really true? It seems this way, but maybe his motivations are so he's got that suspicion,
Mhm.
hermeneutics of suspicion or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that in itself is interesting. Whereas God, at least at the outset, you could presume that he's just innocently accepting Job's sacrifices, Job's praise, Job's righteousness, um,
Hmm.
without suspicion. The role of Satan is to be that suspicious one. And
Yeah.
and so that to me reminds me of the relationship, at least according to McGilchrist, between the right and the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the master, the left hemisphere is the emissary. But so the left hemisphere serves a particular role. It's not like the right hemisphere could do the left hemisphere's job. That's why the left hemisphere exists, right? The right hemisphere doesn't have the capacity to be that tightly analytical and focused. That's why the left hemisphere exists. But
Yeah.
the left hemisphere exists to serve the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere has a real, connection with the whole of the world, which the left hemisphere doesn't have. McGilchrist's whole thesis is that the left hemisphere, in a sense, is myopic, is blinded to its context, and so it tries to break away from the right hemisphere. It tries to be its own master, which is impossible. What's really interesting about that is, in a way, that's that particular aspect of the Christian mythos. That's the relationship of God and Satan in the Christian mythos.
Yeah.
And I think that you can kind of see that ambiguity under the surface here. Like, what is Satan actually, um, what is his motivation, so to speak?
Mhm.
The final thing I'll just say about this, and I'll try and elaborate and develop on this more as we go through the talk, is that
Yeah, because I have some clarifying questions for you, but so
okay?
if you wanna, but you can continue, but I'm just kind of saying like at this point I would like to respond, but feel free to.
This I
Uh,
guess this is the main point with where I'm going with this is that just picking up on that asymmetrical relationship. So for McGilchrist, it's not that the hemispheres are equals. It's not that we need a balance between left and right. The right hemisphere is clearly the superior and needs to be ultimately in charge, but not in a way that would completely, um, you know, destroy or completely subsume the left hemisphere. So I think there's a similar issue here. To me, this is a pattern that recurs throughout the book, which is what I'm calling tentatively. I don't think it's the right term, but it's the only one I can find. There's Satan is the subsidiary opposite of God. So it's not like God and Satan are on the same level. Exactly, yeah. They're not on the same level. But Satan's not merely the obedient servant of God either. He's a
right.
genuine opposite. There's an opposition there. And I feel like that's part of the message of the book, in the sense that one could read it, just to jump ahead, but I will develop on this. One could read it as being an account of how good and evil relate. And you could say, and McGilchrist explicitly makes this argument in The Matter with Things, his more recent book, you could say that good and evil have a similar relationship between the right and left hemisphere, in the sense that good, love, is capable of embracing evil, but evil is not capable of doing the same in regard to good. And so that would be a kind of message that I get from the book. But I'll hand it over to you because you had some questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. The reason why I have some questions is because I'm trying to, like, I know there's, for instance, some people in this little corner that are very interested in the Book of Job, and they
Hmm.
might ask critical questions at this point because I like this reading. But if I focus on the text and at the start, it's actually that, like God asks Satan, like, "Oh, where are you coming from?" And he said, "Well, I've just kind of been roaming the earth." And then it's God who tells Satan, like, have you seen Job? Have you
Hmm.
considered my servant Job? So
Hmm.
there's this sense that like this is just kind of like it could be problematic for your interpretation. So I'm kind of curious what you think about it. That God focuses in on like this is Job. Have you looked at Job? Like Job is sort of so perfect, and that Satan is like, well, actually, if you take a broader perspective, like
Mm.
like Job is only, and I agree, like he is cynical, and that is a more left brain aspect.
Mm.
But nonetheless, it's God who focuses in on a specific at the start, and Satan is really like, well, in the grander scheme of things, is that really true? So it's almost
Yes.
like, he is looking at the bigger picture. So I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
Yes. Yes. I would say that Satan's role is sort of taking things apart, much like the left hemisphere. And so what God does is, yes, you're right. He points out Job and his righteousness, but then
Mm.
Satan then analyzes, takes apart, or tries
Mhm.
to take apart. I
Yeah.
don't think that necessarily is a problem, because just sticking with the McGill-Christian angle, the right hemisphere can notice things, right? The right hemisphere can see individuals, see wholes. Um, McGilchrist really makes that point that it's not just that the right hemisphere is all context. The right hemisphere is
Mhm.
also individuals, right? But not in this abstract way, but in this living way. That would be the difference. And so
Yeah, I
there's,
see.
but I like what you pointed out about this because it, in a way, it's like God instigates this, and
Yeah.
maybe that's another problematic aspect of the text is that there's a sense in which God is conniving with Satan, right?
Yeah.
He's provoking Satan. He's saying, pay attention to this man, probably knowing that Satan's going to do what Satan does and be some kind of problem and take him apart. And I
Yeah.
think,
Well,
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
no, I just want to say, like, I think, and that's really where I imagine some people, depending on your interpretation of the role of Satan in this story, knowing that it's like potentially maybe one
Hmm.
of the oldest Bible books is that Satan could, like, as you already mentioned, it just means sort of the accuser,
Hmm.
um, and sort of he challenges, but it's not to say that, he's Satan in the sense that, oh, he enjoys it when people suffer. Like there's no sense of Satan being part of there, even though like you
Yes,
get that because the Lord tells him like you can do with him whatever you like. But it's
yes,
not, we don't get the sense that Satan is like, finally, because that's what I wanted to do. Like I wanted to make him suffer.
yes,
But you could read it that way, and that's how people often read it.
yes,
But sort of taking that possibility seriously, that God is not telling Satan like, I'm provoking you because I actually want to make you feel bad because you don't like it when people are doing well. It could also be this general sense of like, I'm God, I'm amazing, I'm awesome. Look at Job, like he loves me. And
yes,
so God is mostly thinking about glory and about
yes,
himself and about how great his servant is. And then it's just Satan's role to say like, well, actually, is that really true? So it's
yes,
not so much that he is like provoking against the evil of Satan, if that makes sense. What do you
yes.
think?
I think you can read it both ways, and maybe we should be able to read it both ways, right? You could
Yeah.
read Satan as just performing his role. That would be the left hemisphere properly integrated and aligned with its purpose. But you could
Hmm.
also read it as an aspect of Satan's rebellion in the Christian mythos, right? That Satan actually does enjoy tormenting
Hmm.
Job. And I like ambiguity like this, and I like
Yeah,
that
I agree.
text doesn't tell you. Um,
Mhm.
you have to read into it. When is Satan just waiting for an opportunity to torment someone? Or is he doing it maybe even begrudgingly, like not really wanting to, but out of fierce loyalty to God or loyalty to his purpose? I think
Hmm.
I think all those senses are in there, all those possibilities are in there, and I think that that again goes to the overall issue of the relationship of good and evil, um, because
Hmm.
evil is problematic, and there is a sense in which it genuinely opposes good, but there's also a sense in which it can be subsumed by good and even serves good.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And I think that's definitely where we are headed if we keep reading the story. I just kind of want to sort of take it a little bit slowly because I imagine that people are objecting in their head when they're listening to this.
Yes,
But I agree this, like I also really like the ambiguity about the story. And I think actually having passed beyond this point, I think we can move on a little bit to see how, well, first of all, I think it's interesting, like from a Nietzschean perspective, that what would Nietzsche potentially like about this? Well, first of all, that it's not so much that like God doesn't really seem to care that much that Job, at least for this short time, will be suffering. I
mm-hmm.
think that must be something that somewhat pleased Nietzsche. That
Yes,
it's not like God is enjoying it, so there's not this resentment, but
yes,
there's also the sense like, yeah, I mean, like, sure, go ahead, and that actually also seems to prove a point that should also be relevant for Nietzsche. Is like, well, it's not that you are only a religious individual because, you get great, comfortable benefits of living comfortably and nicely, etc. It's like for Nietzsche also, like that would be a very wrong understanding,
yes,
I'd say, of what it means to live life.
yes,
Um, and even like the strong health, like, Nietzsche tried to make the best of his ill health. So obviously, like there's something for him also interesting in Job in that regard. That okay, how can I deal with the situation of feeling like I'm being tormented?
Hmm.
So I just wanted to mention all that, but I also want to look at Job's first response to what's going on,
Hmm.
because I think that evolves a little bit because he's very like what do you call it? Like he seems to resign to what's going
Yes.
on. He
Yes.
says like naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What's also interesting, by the way, is that it's then said that Job did not sin when he was saying any of this. So it's like,
Yes.
so he's right. We can still agree that he's right. And what's also interesting is that I tried to find the line, but that at some point he is critical of his own wife, who tells him like, you should curse God because look what
Yes.
God has done to you, and that he's like, well, would we really be truly pious if we would only accept the good and not accept the evil? So that
Yes.
already moves towards that point that I think you're interested in making, or that interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think it's really so when I read those first responses from Job, in a way, it's like, well, that is, in a way, the book does tell you kind of the appropriate response to suffering because
Hmm.
it gives it right here at the beginning of the story. And so, but what's striking to me is that then Job needs to go through the entire story. What that tells me, and complain and suffer and feel tempted to curse God and all that kind of stuff. What that tells me is that he knows theoretically, he knows propositionally um, the the correct response. But
Yeah.
that's meaningless. That's meaningless, right? That doesn't
Mm.
that doesn't what happens when he goes through his trial and torment and then God appears to him and then he repents in dust and ashes. Um, all that embodied, lived through experience brings him back to that statement, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall
Mm.
return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That is precisely the answer. But if anything, I think the book is showing us that just mere words like this, even if they're true, are useless. So that's what I get
Yeah.
from this. The other
Yeah,
interesting
no, that's
thing,
fair.
yep.
Yeah.
I'll just say one more thing, and that's the other interesting thing I noticed because you referred to both his responses. So there's the first response when all his wealth is taken away and his um, children are killed, and then there's the second response when he's afflicted with the illness. And the
Hmm.
second response is interesting. You mentioned it before. Shall we receive God, good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And
Hmm.
that's consonant with the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. What's interesting, though, is that the following line is, in all this, Job did not sin
Hmm.
with his lips. And so there's already a sense of he's starting to shift into the state that he'll be in through most of the book of torment, which induces doubt, it seems to me. The
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
response is perfect, at least propositionally, and it's also wholehearted. Like he wholeheartedly can say it, even though he's sorrowing for his loss. And then the second
Hmm.
one, he's starting to be tempted. He's moving into the more active torment.
So you mean that the with his lips is sort of on purpose, that in his head maybe he's not really, or he's not thinking this as much
Or in
anymore. He
his
doesn't
or
believe
in
it, but
his
he's saying
heart,
it.
because at the
Yeah.
very beginning of the story, he offers these sacrifices for his children. It says, "For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." So
Yeah.
it implies there's at least an imperfection there.
Yeah, yeah, I see, I see, I see. And by the way, there's also something interesting. Like this is like a kind of a different angle to the story, but I think it nonetheless could be interesting. Is that Job believes he is acting well, and by the way, that's true because God says he is acting well,
Hmm.
but only by good works. Let's say, like
Hmm.
he's performing the right acts, and I suggest like this is really the William Blake interpretation a little bit, and it's a little bit more esoteric, but I think it's relevant to point out. You see at the first image, so it's slide two.
Hmm.
They have the you have the happy family, so it's the start of the story, and the instruments are hanging above them. So it's like So they're not doing anything with the music. They
Mm.
are being good people, but
Hmm.
they're not doing anything with the music.
Hmm.
And then at the end, and this is again this Blake's interpretation, but they're all playing music. So
Hmm.
it's also this sense like, okay, they are good, they're good people, but
Hmm.
they only have this good morality. And you can see that there could potentially be a Nietzschean interest here. That it's
Hmm.
like, okay, yes, it's a good morality, but are they also, celebrating God's
Yes.
beauty? Because that's really what's coming to the forefront.
Yes.
Like, obviously, later, that God is showing his immense beauty, like the whole cosmic events.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, yeah, I think that's also relevant.
Yes, no, I think that's really interesting. Maybe I wonder if there's even a certain rigidity about Job at the start. I just mentioned, that he's sacrificing for his children just in case they
Yeah.
sin. But isn't that a little bit much? Like, I don't know.
I know, I know, I know. It
Yeah.
does seem a little bit much, and
Yeah.
and God, but at the same time, you don't want to doubt the fact that God is so
Mm,
proud and so
yes.
he's so happy with him. So again, that's another ambiguity because it would be easier for the interpretation if then God said like, he is trying too hard,
Yeah.
like I need to teach him a lesson. But no, God is like, no, he's great, he's perfect. But at the
Yes.
same time, there's something to be said that Job still needs to undergo a transformation, which is
Yes.
exactly, like, and you kind of feel that. And obviously the Jungian point, which I know we won't go into, but I'm saying like it could be interesting because Nietzsche, and Jung like are not necessarily so far apart in this because
Hmm.
Jung was very inspired by Nietzsche.
Hmm.
But what to think about that is that it's not only Job who needs to go undergo some kind of transformation, but it's possible that
Mm.
God in feeling the suffering of one of the people that he put on earth of his foremost servant is
Hmm.
actually also undergoing a transformation of some sorts and
Hmm.
is also he needs to account for being immoral, etc. So
Mm.
like so it's possible that also God, and obviously I don't want to make any metaphysical claims about that God actually undergoing this, but at least that's the pattern. It could be a pattern of the story, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I haven't read Answer to Job, Jung's work on this for quite a while, for many years, but so I might not be being fair to it. What's interesting about the thesis, though, is very generally Jung's more like, like Christians need to just calm down a bit, like they need to be less moralistic. There needs to be a fourth
Yeah.
person of the Trinity, like everything needs to be more earthly, more relaxed, more whole. What's interesting here is that the thesis is that, God needs to be more moral. So it's almost an anti-Nietzschean thrust.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with that, I think, because I'm going in a different direction, but it depends what we mean by moral, whether we can apply morality to God, things like that. So maybe we'll
Mhm.
circle back to that.
Yeah.
Where do we want to go next? So we've dealt with the Hasatan, we've dealt with
It's
Job's
ju-
initial
I
response.
guess
Yeah.
just 1 second. Like,
Hmm.
besides the moral point, I do think there could be something real about God not knowing what it's like to suffer. So there's a potential reading of this
Hmm.
that Job piques God's interest in what it's like to suffer because God is like, what are you talking about? Like,
Yes.
where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?
Yes.
There's something to be said for that. So we're all, let's say, on God's side on that point. But at the same time, God must also be interested in what Job is going through.
Yes.
And maybe, like if you want to have a whole Christian reading of it, he's so interested that he realized, like, I have to become man, like I have to
Yes.
reunite. Anyways, so I'm just
What?
saying like it's not so much the moralistic point that God needs to be better, like he needs to do well, but also God needs to know what it's like to suffer, and
Yes.
that is a Nietzschean point in some
That is a
sense. So
Nietzschean point. That is a
yeah.
Nietzschean point. And what I will say that's also Nietzschean about Jung's take on the story, at least
Mm.
as I understand it, is that God's impressed by the nobility of Job in his suffering. It's
Mm.
almost something, what is something that God lacks, not being able to suffer. And so that's a
That's
very
true.
Nietzschean
Yeah.
reading, like the nobility of humanity is
Yeah.
even outclasses God at this stage, at least in God's development. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
all right, where do we want to
That's a
go
good
next?
point. Yeah. So let's see. Like I obviously like this is really the moment when like we've gone over the story, so I'm not going to recap the whole story, but I'm just saying, like, is there something interesting to be said, like from the point onwards that Job really starts complaining hardcore, and when indeed, like, after the three friends arrive, I think at least some interesting points is that Job really starts saying, like, I should never have been born.
Yes.
Like, I think that's a relevant statement. That's
Yes.
because that does seem to imply that God was wrong, because,
Yes.
if you're being consequential about it, it's like, God shouldn't have put me on this earth. Like, I shouldn't have been born.
Hmm.
So I think that's a relevant point we could discuss. I'm curious what you make of that in this interpretation.
Just one thing on that too that I noticed is
Oh,
that he actually is he's not maybe cursing God directly, but like you said, he's maybe cursing his will, but he's also cursing creation effectively. The whole
yeah.
poetry of that part where he's cursing the night he was conceived, he's cursing the day of his birth, um, and he's really cursing them. Um, it's obviously in some sense a poetic metaphor for I wish that I wasn't born, but it's also I would say a natural expression of resentment against the manifest universe, against the world.
Mm.
I think it's very psychologically apt. It's not just that I don't want to exist and I want everything else to remain untouched. It's that,
Yeah.
no, I want the misery that characterizes my existence to spread to a whole day of the year, a whole night of the year. I want it to be, despised and wiped out and et cetera, et cetera. It's the
I
spreading of
see.
resentment. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's like thinking of the fact that that really happens at the start, relatively speaking, of the whole book.
Hmm.
That could also be an interesting Nietzschean point, that like there is something resentful in Job there, and that seems to, at least like when he gets that revelation at the end, he really, like, everything is put into perspective, and it's like, and he now has no more reason, I think, to be resentful about it, even though he
Hmm.
was at the start. And I think you can imagine someone who was suffering as much as Nietzsche did, that it
Hmm.
was actually very, like, I think this is a point that still interests me a lot in Nietzsche, is that how one reason probably why he was so against the Christian resentment is
Hmm.
because he was so tempted to be resentful
Yes.
some often. Like, I think,
Yes.
like, he, and you can see it come out, that he is clearly resentful against
Yes.
some individuals, for instance, but also that he would just kind of like, it would be tempting for him to be resentful against existence itself, but that would be saying no to life.
Yes.
And he wants to be a yes sayer. And you
Yes.
can kind of see that, like, eventually Job learns to affirm, but not because God tells him, like, okay, because you're gonna get your reward, like, at the end, like, you're gonna have twice much as you had. Like, that's not the reason,
Yes.
but because he sees the bigger picture. Like, he sees, like, oh, actually, all of life is will to power, just to
Yes.
kind of
Yes.
make it a
Yes.
little bit extreme.
Yeah, no, I would
Yeah,
absolutely agree with you. And I think that people that point out aspects or elements of where Nietzsche was resentful and sort of say, well, this just discredits all of Nietzsche's philosophy, are very naive. Like, I think that
I
ex
agree.
what you said is exactly true. In fact, I wouldn't trust a philosopher who talked much about resentment and claimed to have a way to overcome it, who didn't deeply experience resentment. That would be
Yeah.
pretty useless. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and
Um,
by the way, Nietzsche acknowledges this, right? Like, he says, he doesn't say, like, I'm resentful, but he does say, like, while I am a decadent, I am
yes,
also its opposite, and that's really,
yes,
like, I think that's really key, that he is self-aware enough to see, like, yes, I am part of the problem, but I'm also responding to it,
of
you know?
course, of
Yeah,
course. And the same structure is there in Job, someone who suffered so deeply and was so tempted to curse existence. And the perhaps the same pattern is also present in the life of Christ as well. So, yeah.
yeah, I think so.
Mm,
I think so. Like, so you see that's really interesting, because obviously Nietzsche had an affinity with Jesus,
hmm.
and you can kind of imagine how both Job and Jesus and Nietzsche had to deal with the same moralism in their time. That people were saying, like, obviously you're suffering because you're not pious enough, and that's
Yes,
what people also told Jesus, is like,
yes,
it's difficult to imagine, but it's like, yeah, I mean, clearly you're suffering because you think,
yes,
you're not upholding the Jewish
yes,
law, for instance. But the same thing is said to Job. And what's interesting already here, even though, like, this is far older than the New Testament, I'm not saying I understand why people didn't believe Jesus right away. But
Hmm.
that at the end of the story, like God is also angry with the three friends. It says like, you were sinning, Job was right, even though what they were saying was just Jewish
Yes,
orthodoxy. Like
yes.
so, and so you can imagine that's also definitely an affirmative part that for Nietzsche, I imagine that the friends keep saying like, well, Job, really, it.
Hmm.
I think this is just like your problem. You should definitely you should not sin. Like it's all
Hmm.
because you sinned, etc. So it's sort of this life denying. Whereas Job's like, no, I didn't do really anything
Hmm.
wrong.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that's also a relevant angle.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love how the book kind of takes it to the next level because I think that maybe we can easily lose sight of the fact that Job's friends are completely orthodox. Like they are
Yeah.
giving you um, kind of aphorisms or wisdom that you could easily find in the book of Proverbs or any number of places in the Bible.
Hmm.
Um, and so likewise, I think people underestimate with Jesus just how justified is maybe the too inflammatory a word, but just how biblically um, backed up his persecutors were. Like, yes,
Hmm.
if he was claiming to be the Son of God, if he was maybe hinting at or implying that he had some identity with God, of course he should be
Yeah.
killed. So
Yeah.
I like that in both those situations, it's clearly the orthodox um,
Hmm.
that are the adversary.
Small O Orthodox. Don't
Small
get
R
angry with us,
Orthodox. We've
Ortho
got no
bros.
hatred for
Yeah,
yeah,
super.
the Eastern churches. Um,
No problem.
um,
But keep going, yes.
but what I like about it is that it prevents you from, or at least it should, I think, prevent you from collapsing this into a story of just good versus evil. It's about
Hmm.
levels. So I don't think that it's true or fair to say that Job's friends are simply and uncategorically or like unqualifiedly wrong. They're
Hmm.
obviously somewhat right, at least if you think the Bible's inspired, because their position is very strongly represented in the Bible. Likewise, the
Yeah.
Pharisees' position is very strongly represented in the Bible. So it can't be just about right versus wrong. It must be about levels, that the morality of Job's friends is necessary and in a qualified way correct, but not the whole picture. And
Hmm.
likewise, the Jewish foundation for the Christian revelation is correct, and that the Pharisees are correct. And yet, there's something on top of that, or something that transcends that, or something that goes to another level. What that leaves open is the possibility that it doesn't just nullify that lower level still has a place. That's how I'm
Yeah.
thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Like I think there's definitely something to be said that it was just correct. What I could say though, in the ways in which they sinned, because we have to, well, it would be interesting to at least come up with certain hypotheses why God
Yes.
told the friends you were sinning, because according to you just now, like they weren't completely sinning because they were
Yes.
also doing things that were correct in other respects. I think like I heard that the interpretation of Martin Buber was like
Yes.
the I thou,
Hmm.
perspective of this story is that the difference is, and you could argue the same holds for the Pharisees, but obviously that's, yeah, we can talk about that, is that the friends have an I-it relation to God,
Yes.
and Job has an I-thou relation to God. Like Job speaks to God
Yes.
directly. So even though, God ends up correcting Job because
Yes.
God then is like on another level as
Yes.
opposed to Job. So he ends up correcting him. That nonetheless, at least he's engaging with him, like he's wrestling
Yes.
with God. And you could say that the friends and potentially the Pharisees are not, like they're upholding orthodoxy
Yes.
without actually engaging with God directly, or not even trying to. It's not clear that they're talking to God at all. They're just talking to Job,
I
you know.
agree with you. I think that's one of the messages of the book and again, that goes back to the fact that his statement at the beginning, the Lord gave and the Lord taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord, is not sufficient, because
Right.
it's irrelevant if he believes this propositionally or not. It's just irrelevant. But what's
Hmm.
essential is a relationship with God. And
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
agree that that's absolutely the thing. He's pulled into that relationship by necessity because he's afflicted. Um, he's also, I want to emphasize, cultivated that relationship through all his righteous behavior and through all his devotion. So it's not like those are, again, it's a matter of levels. It's not like those are something that can just be dispensed with. If Job
Yeah.
was just a average person, or even worse, like just an actively egotistical person, um, of course, he would never get the vision of God. He would never get the resolution. It would just be a disaster. It would be meaningless. But he's not. The key thing is he's the best of that level. And then God um, maybe lures him into, forces him into a position where it's like,
Yeah.
speak to me, plead with me, demand my
Mhm.
presence.
I agree. I agree. And this is like as I hear you talking, like I'm really again reminded that the story's ambiguity is part of really what keeps me like going back to it
Mhm,
because at the same time that you feel that Job is doing the exactly right thing, you also feel that, for instance, compared to someone like Socrates, who by the way could also come off as pretty arrogant, but
mhm.
that he is not trying to be ignorant about it. Like he's and I mean Socratically ignorant about it.
Yes,
He's trying to really say like, no, I know, like I have not sinned, like I know for sure. And he's essentially correct because we hear that at the start of the story. But at the same time, there's still feels something off about him saying it, right? Like
yes,
even though he's correct, like to kind of
yes,
like put that on. So I wanna balance that too in the story, if that makes sense.
yes, yes.
Okay, let me by the way see because I made some markings and it's kind of interesting. Like I think this is yeah. Okay, I think at some point by the way the when the friends are speaking to Job because I was looking for let's say Nietzschean aspects, right?
Hmm.
At some point this is Job 8, Bildad starts talking to Job
Hmm.
and he starts like just like all the other friends, he starts warning like, you know, what would you do without God?
Hmm.
And some of this really reminded me of the death of God. So even though like the
Hmm.
friends are like more, let's say, decadent
Hmm. Hmm.
compared to Job, nonetheless, I see some at least warnings of that I also find in Nietzsche. So this is Job 8:11, and this is the King James version. Um, and I'll read it until about 18.
Hmm.
So, can the rush grow up without mire? Can the flag grow without water? Whilst it is yet in its greenness and not cut down, it withereth before any other herb. So are the paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrite's hope shall perish, whose hope shall be cut off, and whose trust shall be a spider's web. He shall lean upon his house, but it shall not stand. He shall hold it fast, but it shall not endure. He is green before the sun, and his branch shooteth forth in his garden. His roots are wrapped about the heap, and seeth the place of stones. If he destroy him from his place, then it shall deny him, saying, I have not seen thee. So there's this sense of like, okay, you need to be careful. Like you're taking for granted everything you have.
Hmm.
But you know, the moment you stop believing, that's actually when you'll lose everything. And
Yes,
obviously, like for Job, this is like, you know, what do you call it?
yes,
Like it's like I have already lost everything. So what am
yes.
I even talking about? But I still think it's like a Nietzschean point that it's like, you know, you can't take this for granted. What's going on?
It's
Yeah.
I feel when you say that I feel like this is the threat of meaningless, the encroaching threat of meaningless suffering. Obviously,
Mm.
Job is suffering. He
Yeah.
doesn't know the meaning, but as long as he has faith in God, he has faith that there is some meaning. And so
Mm.
to abandon his faith in God, whether that be by, cursing him or just not believing in his existence, either of those options is to suddenly lose the meaning of suffering. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. That's good. That's
I
worthwhile. And I also think like this is really what's at question. Like, what is the meaning here? Like, and then we go back, like, or at least I'm reminded of the, let's say, the
yes,
Dionysian versus the crucified. Is like, you know,
yes,
they both are valid meanings for sufferings in the sense valid that both of them give a meaning for why you suffer. And
yes,
now we try to find the affirmative, the life affirmative meaning
yes.
for suffering.
I want to go to, let's see, chapter 9,
Hmm.
verse 32, I think. Let me find.
Yeah.
Um, okay, yes. So I'll just read it out. This is in the English Standard
Yeah.
Version translation.
And this is Job talking again, right?
This is Job, yes.
Yeah.
So he's
Yeah.
talking about God. For he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we should come to trial together. There is no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both. Um, and so this is obviously in the context of Job's complaint that God won't answer him, that the implication being that God is being unjust to him without
Hmm.
quite saying it out overtly. But I
Hmm.
found this really important um, because so Job is motivated by the sense of justice. Job is a righteous man, and he's motivated by rectitude and by justice. And so it's not just merely that he's suffering. Like if he was a purely egotistical man, he would have, in a sense, less suffering because he wouldn't feel the outrage against justice. He would just feel like I've been unfortunate, but the moral order of the universe has not been violated or something like that. At the very beginning of the book, when it's introducing Job, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Um, One who feared God and turned away from evil. I kind of see those statements as being not simply identical. Um, they're obviously related. They obviously support each other, but I don't see them as being simply identical. I see the fear of God as being primary and
Yeah.
the turning away from evil as being secondary. Note also that the turning away from evil is a negative action.
Mhm.
Uh, it's it's uh, um, it's a rejection. It's a discrimination. It's something like that. Fear of God, you could argue fear is similar, but obviously it doesn't mean fear in the sense of aversion. It means fear in the sense of awe and reverence and that kind of fear. So that's a positive, fundamentally
Mhm.
positive orientation. Um,
Yeah, and what do you call it? Like this, you should compare this to what is said in Job 28, and then also the final verse that. So that's Job 28:28,
mhm.
because then it is something similar said, which is the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to
Yes.
depart from evil is understanding. So it's like, so obviously this is where we get the famous, what is it like, the fear of Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Mhm.
So that also says something positive. But then to depart from evil is understanding. So like it seems to follow it in that sense that you just laid out, but also because it says that fear of God is something positive, because that also sounds negative that you're fearing God,
Yes.
but it is the start of something positive, which is to become wise. And to then be wise is to depart from evil, and that's to understand.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, and that verse that you mentioned in 28:28 is really critical, I think. And it's an echo of that introduction to who Job is. Also
Hmm.
because like, obviously this is Hebrew poetry, so there's parallelism. So one line says,
Hmm.
one line says what the previous line said, but just in a different way. But
Yeah.
at the same time, there is a reason that that's poetical. It's because the meanings don't exactly equate with each other. There is difference as well as sameness. And so,
Hmm. I
and
see.
so I,
Yeah.
I do think they're actually saying different things. Also, I mean, this is a later development to be fair, but in Kabbalah, Chokhmah, which is wisdom, is an earlier sephirah, is an earlier emanation of God than Bina, which is understanding. So in that sense, it's primary as well.
Yeah.
It's something more fundamental. Um, and then, of course, the affirmative, positive versus the negative turning away. How I see it, I also see it in terms of levels. So what I take, because what's interesting is this book talks, it doesn't talk about the love of God. It talks about the
Yeah.
fear of God. I was reading Simone Weil was talking about Job, and she sort of quoted it as though it was, as though Job was saying, Job, I'm sorry, as though Satan was saying to God, Job doesn't love you for your own sake. But actually, and then I
Hmm.
went to the text and I was like, well, he doesn't mention love at all. Love doesn't come into this. It's fear. But I do think that's important because fear is the appropriate emotional response to the holy. And
Yeah, I
so
agree.
this reminds me of Max Scheler's hierarchy of values, where the holy is at the top. And so fear, awe, reverence, trembling reverence, um, that is the appropriate emotion for the highest possible value. And
Mhm.
in the same hierarchy, the same arrangement of values, um, moral rectitude is high, but not the highest. It's below. It's below the holy. And so
Yeah.
the holy grounds it, and the holy transcends it. And so that's what I see here. Moral rectitude is referring to turning away from evil. It's absolutely appropriate and necessary for human beings to do that. But they have to have an awareness of something even higher, which is the holy, the God Himself, the origin of being, the sustainer of
Mhm.
existence, and I guess this is the controversial part, who transcends the dichotomy of good and evil. That's how I would.
Yeah, and by the way, I think this is you could argue that it levels up. That at the start, he obviously I'm curious what you think about this, but that he is afraid of God because God can punish or reward. So in that
Mhm,
sense, like I'm afraid of God's punishment. But
mhm.
at the end, like the fear is much more like, oh my God, I didn't
Yes,
know how
exactly.
what I was dealing with exactly. So it's not so much like, oh, I'm afraid that he'll punish me, that he'll make me ill.
Yes,
So that's what it starts off as. But like later on, it's far more indeed the sense of this is holy, this is the numinous in the largest sense. That's by the way also I found John Vervaeke has like one small interview clip where he'll states that's really the essential part for Job, that
ah,
he encounters the numinous, and
yes,
because he encounters the numinous, that's really where he gets the insight, because
yes,
otherwise he didn't feel that same connection to life that he did
yes.
before. And yeah.
That's the moment you could say that Satan is proved wrong, because
Mm.
we know then that Job does genuinely fear God, because that's his response to the vision.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good
What's
point.
interesting about the proving, though, is it's dynamic. It's not just let's look and find out. It's that
Hmm.
because as the reader, what can we say? Can we say yes, we've demonstrated that Job at the beginning of the story genuinely did fear God, or can we say that no, we've demonstrated that he genuinely didn't and he made some kind
Hmm.
of progression? This is another ambiguity. And in a way, it's unanswerable because Job had to go through the trial in order to quote unquote find out, you know.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
the finding out was itself creative. It wasn't just merely an observation.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And it makes sense, and that's why this relates to the ambiguity of Satan, which is like on the one
Mhm.
hand, he is, he's Satan, he's evil. On the
Yes.
other hand, he is helpful. Like he actually points out, well, you don't know for sure. Like actually, maybe he needs to fear you more.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
Exactly.
something to be said for that.
So,
Yeah.
so just coming back to that verse and then rounding it off. So the
Yeah.
verse that I highlighted, which is, for he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we should come to trial together. There is no arbiter
Hmm.
between us who may lay his hand on us both. Obviously, from Job's perspective, this is a complaint against God in a way, effectively.
Hmm.
But you could also read it as being basically the message of the story, which is that far from that being some kind of thing to be bewailed, it actually just is the case that God is not a man as I am,
Hmm.
that he is transcendent, that he is the ground of being, and that therefore there isn't an arbiter between, because justice applies to the level of humans. It doesn't apply to the level of the transcendent ground of being. And if there
Hmm.
was an arbiter to lay his hands on both of them, that arbiter would be the true God. Do you know what I mean? And so it has to top out somewhere. There has to be a
Yeah, I
true
see what you
God.
mean.
And the true God has to be beyond justice as we understand it.
So like, and this is really what makes the story so puzzling, and why it also, by the way, reminds me of the whole crucifixion story, which is in some sense equally puzzling when you start
Yes,
thinking about it very deeply. Is that okay, on the one hand, you have that affirmation that Job realizes more and more that God is the most transcendent,
yes,
and at the same time, you feel that God is becoming more intimate. And
yes,
that's kind of what I mean, that if you really think deeply about the crucifixion, you have both those movements as well. That it's like, okay, God is the furthest away, but at the
yes,
same time, he is the closest as possible. And therefore most transcendent and most immanent sort of at the same time.
yes,
And I'm trying to sort of, and I think that ambiguity again is is on purpose, and it's like I I find it sort of escaping my comprehension as I think about it. I'm curious if you have something similar, you
I
know?
want to ask a clarifying question about that, though, when you were
Yeah.
talking about the crucifixion. So I can see what maybe, and maybe this is completely different than what you were thinking. I can kind of see that God is getting more transcendent in a sense that, in the sense that Jesus eventually cries out, why have you forsaken me? But why
Mhm.
do you say has become more and more intimate?
Well, because at least in the Christian tradition, obviously you hold on to the belief that Jesus is also God incarnate in some
Mm.
sense. So that means that at that same moment,
Hmm.
Jesus is suffering and he is becoming so human that he indeed, it's
Yes.
like, God, why have you forsaken me? And at the same time, you feel that, by the way, this is also obviously in the Gospels itself, at the moment that he dies, like that the whole earth shakes.
Yes.
So like you have both those sentences, that he's the most human God has ever been. And at the
Yes.
same time, you feel that he's the most divine because by doing so,
Yes.
he you could say like that's the definitive statement why that God is different than all other gods we've ever heard of. Like there's
Yes.
something, yeah. So I
Okay.
mean in that sense, yeah.
I see what you're saying. And then, from a Christian perspective, you could go further and you could say, well, actually, that's the reason why Christ is resurrected, because at that moment, God is
Hmm.
completely, I don't know what to say, integrated or embodied or
Yeah,
becomes
yeah.
flesh, such
I
that,
know, I know, I
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah,
That's kind of why I'm really playing with the Jungian interpretation, but I'm trying to be both respectful to the tradition and to
yes,
Jung, etc., and trying to balance all of that out. But there is really something to be said that indeed Job realizes God's true nature, but God realizes Job's true nature,
hmm,
and it's actually it's almost like romantic a little bit. And by the way, if you like, you can I think you can go. People can clearly go too far in this interpretation that it becomes a little bit tricky and dangerous.
hmm,
But to see some of this in the William Blake images, you can see it, I think, on, for instance, the sixth slide,
hmm,
and then also on the third slide, where you see that actually Job is perfectly in God's likeness, according to that story. Which, by the way, already a problem. Like, where you're not supposed to make any image of God. This is the reason. But I'm
hmm,
just saying, like, there's something to be said for that
hmm,
interpretation. But I don't want to make it all encompassing, because I think that's tricky.
hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Let me see what else. What else we got? Um, do you have any other, like? I'm still at sort of Job 10. I know we skipped forward a bunch of times, but do you have something different there in those middle sections?
I'm just looking through my notes. There's nothing that I've seriously highlighted or circled, so I think that I'm okay to skip over this part.
Yeah, I think like so. For instance, I'll just mention like a few loose sentences, which is not like you can respond to it, but you don't have to. So, for instance, Job 13:15, he says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, but I
Hmm.
will maintain mine own ways before him." I think that's also one of those
Hmm.
nice balancing acts. Like I trust in him, but I also maintain like sort of my authentic self. Like I'm not gonna just resign. Like okay, I just accept this. So
Hmm.
there's this interesting balance there, which might also be an indication of why Job doesn't sin
Hmm.
because he's both staying faithful but also honest.
Hmm.
Um, and also, there's hope of a tree if it be cut down that it will sprout again. This is Job 14:7.
Hmm.
Then the friends go on, obviously. Job says in Job 16, miserable comforters are ye all, which I think is also fairly interesting. And then on yeah, Job 16:21, he said that one might plead for a man with God as a man pleadeth for his neighbor. So he's also asking this compassion at this point, which I think is
Hmm.
also an interesting aspect. And then Job says in 17:10, he says, I cannot find one wise man among you. So it's interesting that Job recognizes that what they are doing is not wisdom.
Hmm.
And eventually, obviously, God is identifying whatever Job is doing with wisdom,
Yes.
even though we could argue, as we just did, that wisdom nonetheless progresses
Hmm.
throughout the time.
Hmm.
And then obviously in Job 19:25, he has that very interesting line, I know that my Redeemer liveth,
Mm.
which is probably about God at that point. But obviously people read this in a different context and then think about Jesus at that point. But I think it's nonetheless worth, yeah, thinking about if that holds any relevance, because for many people it does. So I'm curious what you think, and then we can go on to 21 and then the rest, etc.
It is very curious. To be honest, I don't know what to make about that little section.
Mm.
Let me just read it now. So this was
Yeah.
1925. Yeah.
No, no, yeah, yeah, I think so. Yes, yes, that's correct.
I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Although I've got a
Hmm.
footnote in my version that says, yet in my flesh could also be read as without my flesh I shall see God. So, so
I see.
here's some of the ambiguities of translation, which
Yeah.
I know that these verses have been kind of used as, this is referring to resurrection, um, whether it be,
Mm.
well, effectively the resurrection, or the general resurrection that we will
Hmm.
be raised. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it's very curious. I don't know to be, I mean, yes, potentially referring to God. Um, because in the context of the story, there's no other redeemer. There's no one else that would
Yeah.
come and redeem him. What do you make of
No,
it?
exactly. Well, that's more or less why I'm stuck a little bit, and why I understand why so many people just
Mm,
obviously, yeah, like why so many people read Jesus into that line. But I do think that it makes sense that for him, it's God that would redeem him. But at the same, it feels weird to say that I know that my Redeemer lives. Like it's like, what do you mean? Like he never doubted that he lived, right? But maybe it could be the sense that his friends are arguing that Job is not a believer.
hmm
And this is Job responding to that and saying, like, no, 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 God will redeem me and he lives.
hmm
So I think that's like I'm really not sure. This, by the way, like why I was pointing it out. Like it's a question for me, a genuine question.
hmm Yeah,
Um,
it might be something to dive into. I might see if I can see what like Jewish commentary says about it, just to sort of gain a
yeah,
non-Christian perspective or a sense of what it could mean in a Jewish context rather than
exactly.
yeah. But yeah, it's
That, that
curious. We'll
that
have to
that's
leave
that's why I
that as
asked
a
the
question
question.
mark. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because it's like because the only interpretation I got was an apologetic one, which is like,
Yes.
oh, and that's where that's the
G-
Jesus line.
Generally, I think that well, other examples I've seen of, Old Testament prophecies of Jesus, they tend to have a fairly straightforward, like in context reading, which isn't to deny that they may also be prophetic in a deeper way, but they have a in context reading. And I'm not sure what this in context reading is, but I'm
Yeah,
sure that it's there because that's how these books function or operate. But
yeah.
anyway, um,
And then I want to say like I'm skipping forward a little bit unless you want to pause, but like Job 23,
mhm.
he talks about the left hand and the right hand. So I was like, well, I haven't really thought deeply about that line, but this is Job 23, verse 9. He says, on the left hand where he doeth work, but I cannot behold him.
Mm.
He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. So I'm not sure if that's relevant, if there's any symbolism to the right or the left, because it seems somewhat similar, but at least it's this apprehension that the left hand, he's working, but I cannot see it.
Yeah,
Um,
the obscure,
yeah,
the nefarious, maybe. I don't know. Obviously, left
yeah,
being sinister. Um, I wanted to very quickly touch on where I haven't even marked the verse, but this happens in chapter 25. How then can
hmm,
man be right before God? How can he
yeah,
how can he who is born of woman be pure? So, great Old Testament proof text for original sin. Only problem, who says it? Not Job, not God, Bildad.
yeah, yeah, I know.
His friends, I think there's maybe one or two other places where they say something similar, but it's not the position of God and it's not the position of Job. It's
Yeah,
the position of the friends who are shown to be wrong at the end of the story. So I just
yeah, yeah, yeah.
find that interesting.
Yeah. I and I think there's this it's interesting because theodicy, that's what this is. Obviously, theodicy is a term by Leibniz, so that's like an enlightenment term. But it's the sense, like that we need to account for God's ways to men But
Hmm.
now, this verse is about accounting for man's ways to God. How can man be justified with God? So I think that's also an interesting contrast. But I agree with you. Like I think that's really. I had also marked that same sentence. It is noteworthy that Bildad speaks to it, and then indeed, when we get to 28, which we already touched on a little bit because we talked about the last verse,
Hmm.
but you were totally right to point out that it's not clear who says this. It's
Hmm.
not even clear if someone is saying this or if
Hmm.
it's like thoughts that appear because it's also like, let's say, in the middle, it's in between different sections,
Hmm.
you know? So do you make something out of it? Did you have anything marked there, for instance?
Let's have a look. I mean, the main thing that I got from that was that kind of what I see as a summary, which is verse 28.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's mysterious to me as well. In this version of the Bible, the ESV, it says, that the title is Job Continues, implying that it's Job saying this. But reading through it, it's really confusing as to if it is really him who is saying this. Um,
Yeah, and also because every first chapter it says Job is saying this or someone is saying this. You have it at the
yes,
start of 27 and you have it at the start of 29, but you don't have it at the start of 28. So that's what makes it interesting. So it's
precisely.
not clear that Job is saying it.
I mean, it's about the obscurity of wisdom. It's about sort of its hiddenness,
Hmm.
its value. Uh, and then, of course, and then we get a definition of wisdom in a sense. The fear of God is wisdom. So, I mean, I think it's fitting with the book itself, which is that there is this deep mystery, but it's it's
Hmm.
it's located in God, and one can have some kind of apprehension of God. Uh,
Yeah.
but but potentially one could read it as saying, but one can't propositionally have that. One has to
Hmm.
have it through an
Hmm.
experience.
I see. And it's also you can kind of see that it's also like that there's this breaking of frame because indeed it's all about okay, where is wisdom? Where can wisdom be found? This is verse 12 there, and
Mhm.
where is the place of understanding? Like oh, it's not found in the land of the living. The depth said it's not in me. The sea said it's not in me. So like there's this sense of like we're looking to find it, as opposed to indeed transforming ourselves. Like it's like
Exactly.
we're searching for gold.
One
You
thing I
know
did note here is that the kind of means to find it that are invoked are very left hemisphere means.
exactly. Yeah.
With
Yeah.
man doing work, man making mine shafts, like industry, like technology. Of
Yeah.
course, they can't find it.
It's
It's a right
it's like
hemisphere phenomenon.
Tower of Babel kind of
Yes,
stuff.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. And then I think one last thing before we get to God's speech, and that's really, I
Mhm.
think, like the going to be the last main section of our
Mhm.
talk today, is that there's this whole section. It's actually quite large of Elihu. So it's the fourth individual who is younger than the three older men who are with
Mhm.
Job. And I'm just kind of curious what you like. He does make an interesting, different argument that he says it's not about your past sin, it's to prepare you for the future. So like there is some interest in it, and I'm also not sure if God says that Elihu has sinned. I'm really not sure. I just know that he has this long monologue, like
Well,
spanning multiple chapters.
he doesn't say that Elihu has sinned, right? Because I believe does he name let me go to the verse. He names
Yeah.
the friends and he doesn't name,
Well, he's just talking to Eliphaz the Temanite, and this is Job
and
42
against
verse
your two
7.
friends. Yeah.
Oh yes, exactly. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah. So not Elihu, which is kind of also interesting, um, because it's also not clear that he, like, he's just kind of there,
He's
but it's
obviously the one scholarly argument is that he's been inserted. Like this is an
yeah,
interpolation into the text.
yeah,
It
yeah.
it
I
certainly has
imagine.
the signs of it, to be honest. Not that that should discredit it or something, or say it's not a legitimate part of the book, but it could have been
Hmm.
a later edition. What was the purpose for the interpolation? Was it um, because sort of the theologically minded weren't satisfied with the book as it was, that it seemed too dangerous, that they needed
That's a good int.
a
Yeah.
devoted voice to come in and say, because you're right, he has maybe a different spin or a different argument, but it's I think broadly in line with his friends' arguments, and he's got this
Hmm.
kind of overconfidence in God that his friends do. in a
Yeah.
negative sense of overconfidence, not in a faithful sense, but in a I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And by the way, and I think there is this one William Blake picture where like the vision that he's talking about is also laid out, but it's not convincing. And you can contrast that with God coming by in the whirlwind.
Mhm,
So you have the slide after that, and you can kind of see the difference between let's seeing a true vision of God and this
mhm,
proposed vision of like, this
mhm,
is what it's all about. So I think there's still this sense that it's not sufficient. But yeah, why was it inserted? And also why was this a younger individual that could also
mhm,
have been story-wise? There's, let's say, a hierarchy.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, I, I don't know for sure. I'm curious if people in the comments can help us out. But like, what is interesting? Should it be according to thy mind? Is Job 34, 33, and then 35 is Job hath spoken without knowledge, and his words were without wisdom. He added rebellion unto his sin. He clapped his hands among us, and multiplied his words against God. So even if it was inserted later,
mm.
it's quite a stupid insertion
Yes.
because this is someone who is sort of like you've already read the conclusion of the story where Job was clearly the wisest, and
Mhm,
now this again someone who was against it. So I really don't see the function of it if it was inserted later, even though it could have been.
mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. It's a question mark, but let's go to the kind of what would you say the pinnacle of the story, the
Yeah, 38.
yeah, that critical moment where God appears to Job in the whirlwind. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. And then he goes on to describe the creation and
Hmm.
asking all these rhetorical questions. Where were you? You know, how do you do this? How do you do this? How do you make the rain fall? Like how do you sort of manage the animals and give them their individual being and their individual habits and their individual wisdom. So, and so,
Hmm.
where we would expect an answer from God, we don't get an answer. We don't get anything propositional, really. We just get
Hmm.
a grand vision of creation. I think there's two visions here. One is the vision of God directly. Um, it doesn't explicitly say that God appeared, but you just get the sense he's talking out of the whirlwind. But later on, Job says, I had heard you with my ear, but now I have seen you with my eye. So I feel there's a sense in which there is a direct revelation of God, that whatever God is manifests to Job in some way.
Yeah.
So you've got,
Yeah, and this is
mm,
interesting to look at slide 17, like if we can show
mhm,
it, because you have the sense that everyone is looking down except for Job, who is the only one looking up, but he is terrified, that's clear. And that's the whirlwind, and he's sort of in this group of angels. And then after that, you see what it looks like when God sort of shows part of creation, and then we're gonna go into
yes.
the Behemoth and the Leviathan, which is the slide after that. So I think all of these are really great images to sort of keep in mind when we talk about this.
So you get, I think, two visions. You get the vision of God himself, which is kind of in the background of the text, like it's not dwelt on because
Yeah.
it's the presupposition. And then you get the vision of creation. And so what's really interesting to me, reading through this is what kind of things are demonstrated, like what kind of things are shown. And it seems to me that a lot of what is shown is um, that which is kind of glorious, powerful, strange,
Hmm.
dangerous. Okay. So these sort of elements of chaos, you could say, the chaotic side of existence, of nature. But they're also beautiful. They're also presented in a way that one senses their own value. But they're also dangerous. Like there's a verse that I highlighted. This is chapter 29. This is,
39 or
sorry, 39. You're right.
oh
39.
yeah, yeah.
I didn't properly note it. So let me just find it. 39. 20 something, 20.
What
Yes.
is it about? Yeah.
I've got it now. So it's 39, let's say 29 to 30. So
Hmm.
from there he spies out the prey. His eyes behold it from far away. His young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there he is. It's talking about the hawk or the eagle. I think it's the eagle, the
Hmm.
specific verse. And so you get eagles, you get hawks and birds of prey, you get lions, you get ravens, you get, but then you also get kind of the somewhat absurd or the strange. You get the ostrich. Um, the ostrich with its great speed, but also with its apparent stupidity and cruelty.
Yeah.
So you get all these different phenomena that kind of partake in the element of chaos. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, I see
so
that.
that's significant. That seems to be a significant part. Um,
Yeah, it's also really to try to like you can also have a different reading of this, right? So like so and this again to in a friendly way challenge your own interpretation because I actually really
mhm.
love it that this sense of like okay, you know, like he is affirming all of like the chaotic aspects of nature. But you could also say that from a more theodicial perspective, that God is saying, okay, you know, Job, yes, obviously, yes, I have to deal with this sense of specific evil on your behalf because you're suffering even though you didn't deserve it. But look, the world is a mess, you know, like it's
Yes,
full of all of these complex aspects, and I can't go about, you know, like dealing with everything all the time. Like look, there's a mess over there and a mess over there and a mess over there. So
yes,
there, I think that's also a possible reading here, if you know what I
yes.
mean.
And it's
Yeah.
definitely a reading that I've heard. I think that I love the Bible Project, but
Oh
I think
yeah, yeah, they're
that's
great.
their reading of this book. That the video they did on this is magnificent, by the way, visually and so
Mm.
forth. But their reading is basically this reading of there's so much complexity in the universe, and God has to, as it were, balance all
Hmm.
this complexity, and the complexity is beyond our comprehension. I think there's an
Yeah.
element of that here because I think that partly what is God is saying, look at all this complexity. You don't have the wisdom to manage all this. Manage is the wrong word. It's too left hemisphere, but you know, the ability to kind of embrace all this, let's say. Um,
Mhm. Yeah, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. And there
but
is something
mm,
to be said also for the example specifically because I think that that's what the I'm not yeah, it might have been a while ago, but like that the Behemoth and the Leviathan are also um emphasized in the Bible Project analysis that they
mhm,
mention like you know these are what do you call it? Like very terrible, terrifying
mm,
creatures. So like they're crazy, but I created them, you know? Like
yes.
so actually that's also part of evil, but you know, I like they're under my domain. They're in my domain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that unless I'm misremembering, I think they even say that these creatures are good. The Leviathan and the Behemoth are good because they're God's creations, which I agree with. Like,
Yeah.
I agree with the sentiment, but I do see
Yeah.
a potential conflict with the sort of interpretation where everything has to work out to be just. So this is where I would push back against that interpretation. Yes, I think there's an element of look at how wonderfully everything works together being put forward here, but I don't think that the way it fits together is being shown as being somehow just. Do you know what
Mhm.
I mean? I don't think, and that puts God in a rather absurd position, as though he's created this whole universe and he's desperately trying to seek moral order, but he's constantly having to juggle these different factors. It
Yeah.
doesn't feel convincing to me. It doesn't feel spiritually uplifting. It feels
Yeah.
left hemisphere. The other thing I noticed reading through the
I
text
agree.
is just that, and this is not bad because remember, the left hemisphere is good in its own sphere, but judicial language, um, moral language, language about justice is very left hemisphere. It's all about balancing. It's all about precision. It's all about, this kind of adversarial relationship. It's about judgment. It's very left hemisphere stuff. And I don't
Yeah.
think it has the capacity to encompass the whole of reality because of that very reason. It's appropriate to humans, but it's not
Hmm.
appropriate to the hawk, the eagle, the Leviathan, the
Yeah,
world
yeah.
itself, you know?
I think by the way, like this is also something to keep in mind when we hear Jesus arguing with the Pharisees, but also
Hmm.
just telling people, like giving them some advice, like don't focus on, and I'm not
Mhm.
saying, anything goes like that. That's
Mhm.
not the point. It's kind of to say, like, really focus on the whole and not, the specifics. Like you're focusing on the specifics as if it's done by that. So like there's also, let's say, a more right hemispheric movement there.
Mhm.
But also I think I also agree with you that there's something overly focused and specific, and even I would say anthropocentric, to argue that God is just really trying to balance out all the good and evil sort of in the universe. I also am more sympathetic to the view that God would be uniquely involved sort of in history and
Mhm.
working out his story, and that's why he cares about individuals such as Job and
Mhm.
Moses and Jesus, etc. Well,
Mhm.
Jesus obviously a special role there
Especially,
from a
yeah.
Christian perspective.
Yeah.
Um, but having said that, like I don't feel as compelled as other people, but maybe that's just because I haven't suffered enough, to be fully tormented by the notion that God like cares so much for each individual, that each individual deserves the good life without suffering. Like, and
Mhm.
by the way, this goes back to our conversations about, is a good life really without suffering? But even
Yes.
besides that, like, the examples of bone cancer in
Yes.
children,
Yes.
that Stephen Fry, etc., gives. Like, for some reason, I don't find it as compelling, even though I understand why it's compelling if you
Yes.
believe that, everyone is special and made in God's image, and et
Yes.
cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I'm more or less on your side in the interpretation here, even though I know that we might infuriate some Christians here, but I'm really, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I
What do you
think
think?
to that point, to sort of maybe strengthen our position, I would say that we do want to emphasize that m morality and justice are not only appropriate to human beings, but obligatory for human beings. That it's not just it's not
Hmm.
that they're somehow to be dispensed with. And that's certainly not the case in the book of Job. There's no point where Job says, okay, well, justice never mattered.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Although
see
you
what you
could
mean.
read it as a transcending of being only concerned with justice
Hmm.
and with, but that level remains totally in place. For
Yeah,
human beings, justice is incumbent. And I would say more than this, that justice and virtue more broadly can ennoble us, can purify us, and can bring us therefore closer to a closer relationship with the holy. Even though the
yeah,
holy isn't justice, the holy is not just moral order, the holy transcends it and grounds it. And that's the
yeah.
other thing I would say is that, um, I think that what God is, and maybe this is me reading into this to some extent, but I do think that there's sort of two lessons from God showing the creation to Job. One of them is just simply look at all these things. They are intrinsically valuable, even though they transcend your categories of morality. Um, look at all these wonderful, interesting, majestic, beautiful, strange creatures that exist. It's just good that they exist. And I send water to the desert, even though there's no humans there. Like I don't, I'm not anthropocentric in a certain sense, like in a all-encompassing
Yeah,
sense. So that's one lesson. And I think
yeah.
there's
I
another
see.
lesson which you could take from it as well, which is that all of this stuff, the fact that the world exists, the fact that all this stuff in nature exists, the fact that we've evolved in this environment to have these particular capacities that we have, including the capacity of intellect, including the capacity to relate to the absolute being, all of this enables us to be just. All of this is the background, the enabling, affording background for things like human justice, good human society, human love, human care. All of this is afforded by the, you could say, amoral
Hmm.
background of nature. And so, in that way, it's not like they're antagonistic to each other. They just have this particular relationship of the one
Yeah.
affords the other, as well as being intrinsically valuable. It's about balancing all these values, well, not balancing, but having all these values together in an integrated whole. What do you think
Yeah,
about that?
no, and actually, like I'm reminded of something you shared with me before we started recording. So in our conversations before, that you mentioned that this is what doesn't make it wholly Nietzschean, let's
Yes,
say, which would be, well, okay, obviously, like we don't
depending.
want to be
Yeah.
too crit yeah, okay, like it tends to at least a version of Nietzscheanism, which would
Yes.
be like, good and evil are relative, and therefore I could do whatever I want. And I think what you're emphasizing, and by the way, I am reminded now we are getting back to Plato in this way because it's very Neoplatonic on the different levels of like,
Mhm.
of being. It's like everything in its proper place,
Yes.
and everything in its proper place means that we need to uphold morality, but that at a higher level we go beyond the moral,
Yes.
and beyond good and evil, etc. And you
Yes.
could also say it like in the sense of values, like that beauty is not itself beautiful, but it makes other things beautiful.
Mhm.
But by grasping beauty, you're not grasping something which is itself beautiful, or
Yes.
truth is not itself true, but it
Yes.
makes other things true.
God,
Goodness, this
God,
gets to your point.
God affords
Yeah.
justice. God affords justice without himself. I mean, it sounds controversial and almost inflammatory to say it, but without being just in this human way, he
Yeah.
affords justice. And not only affords justice, but affords all the diversity of values that we find in other beings that are not human.
Hmm.
And so I think
Yeah.
this is the picture, and it's not devaluing justice. It's just saying that it has its own place. It's you could say it's relative to human beings, but so long as you're a human being, it's absolute, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Like if you're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
God. And that brings me actually to Leviathan and Behemoth. So
Hmm.
what role do these monsters play, or these magnificent, strong,
Yeah.
dangerous creatures? I think they
This will
play.
be slide 19 and 20, by the way. Like
Okay, yeah,
I
yep.
think it's worthwhile. No, you don't have to look them up, but I'm just saying, like, I think these are absolutely beautiful
Oh yes, I
pictures
agree.
to
I'm
have in front of
picturing
you.
I'm
Yeah.
picturing them in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so this is what I think that the role of Leviathan Behemoth are in the story, which is sort of God's second part of his speech after a brief interlude from Job. First of all, and these there's ambiguity here too. I'm about to tell you kind of two contradictory interpretations, but I think they come together. The first one is that Behemoth and Leviathan represent God himself. And why do I say that? Because they inspire fear, awe, reverence, wonder. Okay? They're
Hmm.
dangerous. God is dangerous. God is clearly
Yeah.
dangerous because the whole story suggests, or not even suggests, but almost states that he's afflicted Job with terrible suffering. Sure, he's done it in a sense via Satan, but that doesn't matter. It all comes back to God. This is pure monotheism. So God is dangerous, just like those creatures. But but by showing Job and describing them to the point of almost showing Job these magnificent, powerful creatures, he's giving him a sense of awe and reverence and wonder that brings him closer to the awe and reverence and wonder of the absolute being itself, or the ground of being itself. That's how I would interpret that. And
I see that. Yeah.
a similar thing is happening when he shows him creation itself. So when you see that, when you consider creation as a whole, or when you consider like certain sublime aspects of creation, you're automatically climbing the ladder of values. Like you're
Mhm.
automatically moving towards the holy itself. You're getting a intimation of the holy. So that's the first interpretation.
Yeah. A
The second.
Heideggerian would say from beings to being
Yes,
almost.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. That's the route you should take. You should go from justice to awe and reverence of creation, maybe to awe and reverence of God, something like that. So the second interpretation is in tension with it, because in the second interpretation, Leviathan and Behemoth are representing the evil aspects of creation, the chaotic and evil aspects, the aspects of creation that enable Job's family to be killed, for his wealth to be stolen, and for his body to fester with boils in terrible pain. So These two are all part of creation. God doesn't, create some new thing that comes into the world. He uses natural phenomena to afflict Job. So Leviathan and Behemoth then represent the evil in the world, but they have a particular relationship to God.
Mhm.
God makes it clear that He is their creator and master. He embraces them. He affirms and embraces them, and again, manages is the wrong word, but He is their master. He has the ability to use them and to deal with them. Humans don't. I think it's very clear in those passages that humans don't. Like he's both
Yeah.
saying it and he's presuming it, God, that
I
humans
think I think
do not.
specifically the line like, "Can you draw out Leviathan with a
Yes,
hook?" It's like,
yes.
no, you can't.
You
Yeah.
can't, and you shouldn't
Yeah.
try because that will spell
Yeah.
disaster. And so that's really interesting because to me that affirms that God does transcend the relative duality of good and evil, the evil that, sorry, the good that exists as opposed to evil, that kind of good. He does transcend it, but humans don't have the right to work on that level. So this would again be against a kind of more surface Nietzschean approach, which would say good and evil are entirely relative. We need both. And there's truth in both of those statements based on what we've just been talking about. Therefore, I should be, a little bit good and a little bit evil whenever necessary. But I
Mm.
think this is saying no, you
Yeah, yeah,
cannot
yeah.
you cannot mess with evil. You cannot, as a human, deal with evil. Evil is God's domain. Evil is for
Yeah.
God to deal with, not for humans. Does that
And
does that
no,
resonate?
it does ring true, and I think it allows us to talk a little bit about like I think that's really fascinating what you just shared, and I think you were developing this idea, at least like you were more or less communicating it to me about a week ago, and it's been definitely on my mind since. Um, and it allows us to potentially be indeed a little bit more critical of Nietzsche. I'm not sure because like Nietzsche was extremely aware of all the kind of ways in which he could be criticized, it seems. So
Hmm.
like it's always very, yeah, you should be very careful with criticizing Nietzsche. But what I would say is that there is something to the criticism that even though I disagree with the easy reading that Nietzsche is not about, oh, we have to create our own values, like it's
Hmm.
not so easy. It's not so
Hmm.
easy. But nonetheless, there's something to be said that with the death of God, man in the abstract has to sort of
Hmm.
create and has to sort of self-create these images and these values to live by. So not necessarily an individual, but maybe over multiple generations, etc. And
Hmm.
there is something uh, very risky about that in an ego inflation sense,
Yes.
but also beyond the ego inflation sense, it also seems to be more or less impossible if I read it this way.
Hmm.
If we buy the meaning of the story as this laid out currently, then it seems very difficult to uphold that understanding of what humanity could be up to, unless you truly believe that indeed God has sort of no real effect anymore in this world.
Hmm.
But it still seems that he was also aware that yes, okay, but it has structured our thinking for
Hmm.
millennia, and
Hmm.
that's not just gonna change from one day to the other. So I think it's allowing me to be a little bit more critical of some of his proposed solutions, even though it was right, let's say, in some of his diagnoses.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I do think the whole values creation part of Nietzsche is it's the weakest part of Nietzsche. I don't really have a way to comprehend it. And I think that's partly coming from Scheler, it's partly coming from Jung. Like it doesn't seem like that's true to the phenomenology of values. Uh,
Mhm.
that we just make them up. It doesn't seem that
Yeah.
way. It seems that they are there in some
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
And by the way, like there's also like I was reading the Gospel of Matthew,
Hmm.
and it's also said a few times. I think it's also said in Mark once, something to the effect of like, offenses happen. They need to happen. Or
Yes.
Jesus says like, as it is written, the man will be the son of man will be delivered. So like
Yes.
this is all supposed to happen. I'm gonna be
Yes.
crucified. So but woe to those by
Yes.
whom it happens. So
Yes.
and that also shows this aspect that you're laying out. It's like, yes, this is all part of, I'm affirming it all, this has to happen, but at the same time I'm condemning the individuals who do it, right?
Yes.
So you also have this relative level that you're talking about, I think there,
Yes.
potentially.
Or if not, even if you don't want to say use a strong language as condemning or as moralistic language as condemning, you're at least
Woe to those.
objectively,
Yeah.
yeah, woe to those. Like those who do that will be, in a sense, spiritually destroyed by the
Yeah,
very
yeah, that's
nature
correct.
of
Yeah.
their action. That's why, again, like thinking about it in terms of Behemoth and Leviathan, it does kind of evacuate some of the moralism from that. Because if you try and deal with Leviathan, you will be destroyed. It's not that you're bad for doing it and he's going to punish you. It's just that that's the nature of Leviathan. If
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
if you become a vicious person, you will be destroyed. If you deal with evil, you won't master it, but you will be destroyed by it.
Mhm.
That's the human position, and that makes that for me was like a light bulb moment of like you know, this is the value of morality. This is the value of organized religion.
Mhm.
This is why we shouldn't be too eager to dispense with it. Um,
Mhm.
these are all good and appropriate, but where they become problematic, at least for me, is where they try and they try and judge all of existence or judge the ground of existence based on those standards. To
Mhm.
me, and sounds like to Nietzsche, then they become somewhat pathological, somewhat destructive.
Yeah, 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 I see, I see. And I think that's why it's really helpful that sort of Christ sort of keeps saying throughout the Gospels, like, it's about who is entering the kingdom of heaven. And again, if you
Hmm.
read that in that line, like who's literally going to go to an afterlife, yeah, that's a possible reading. I would suggest you don't use that reading, though. I mean, there's possibly something to it. But what I would indeed say is that it says something about, okay, as long as you reject sort of this understanding of reality,
Hmm.
you will be sort of, um, let's say, suffering unnecessarily. You won't be, let's say, suffering in a way that you can affirm it. And
Hmm.
that's the thing. I don't think, well, this is obviously another discussion that we need to have at another time, also because we're nearing the end of our time, I'm noticing.
Hmm.
But I don't think, in that sense, what Jesus is saying is, we need to get to the end of suffering, but we need to get to the end of a particular kind of suffering, and that the suffering that is happening is particularly wrong going
Hmm.
on there. And you kind of see that, like in the book of Job as well, that he, like, I think at the end, let me just read it out. So this is the final chapter,
Hmm.
42,
Hmm.
and then verse 2. This is Job responding to everything that God has just said. So, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. So there's this this sense, getting back to sort of my interpretation, that through this understanding, Job is very much aware of his place. So like he was
Hmm.
sort of, it was like, and also like hearing by the ear,
Hmm.
it seems to imply that God is next to him, but now
Hmm.
he's right in front of him. So
Hmm.
I think there's all these aspects that are uh, relevant. And I would also say, like, if you've ever had a something, and I'm not saying you specifically, but if someone has had a mystical experience, it could be in meditation or prayer or psychedelics, whatever, like I
Hmm.
don't care. But the sense of like, okay, you feel both incredibly small and satisfied through that at the same time. It's a
Hmm.
very weird thing.
Hmm.
And by the way, it starts to feel satanic when you feel your power increasing, and this is
Yes.
really the dark side
Yes.
of Nietzsche.
Yes.
But yeah, anyways, okay.
No,
Um,
I would say to that, that at the end of the story, um, Job is liberated from himself or his own ego. And I'm not
yeah,
saying that to imply that he had some sort of big ego. It's almost just the human condition. Like he's
yeah,
liberated from the innate and necessary self-centeredness of human consciousness. because he's shown the awesome majesty of the world. And on top of that, he's shown the real center of the universe, God. So he's completely decentered. And that goes to what you were saying, that there's this
Mhm.
intense smallness, but there's this intense satisfaction in that smallness because now it can't be the same. His suffering is still real and it's still negative, but it can't have the
Mhm.
same significance as it once had, where it's
Mhm.
like something is wrong with the whole universe. Something
Mhm.
is wrong with God because I'm suffering. It's like actually, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
as long as God exists, doesn't really matter, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. And also to kind of see, by the way, it's not just like, even though I'm suffering, it's fine because of the whole, I can sort of affirm the whole. It's also to see that God has pointed out all of these chaotic aspects of the
Yes,
cosmos. So it's to see that there is suffering everywhere, like on a
everywhere,
cosmic scale.
everywhere.
So,
Yes,
and that's also the Nietzschean point. You can kind of see like, oh, and I should really maybe, you know, dim it down a little bit. Like,
ex
yeah,
exactly, exactly. So
great.
what about, shall we just say a few words on the epilogue? Because
Yeah,
this is
that sounds
when
good. That sounds good. And
this
then
is
then I also have to finish off. But like I do enjoy
yes.
this very much. But let's continue on the epilogue. Yeah.
So this is where Job actually gets everything back, and he doesn't just get it back; he gets it doubled, except for his children. He gets the same amount of children, but he gets everything else doubled: the sheep, the goats, or whatever they are, all the wealth
Yeah.
that he has. He gets twice as much. So what's going on here? Because you linked me to a master's thesis, I think it was by someone named Sherwood,
Mm.
and they were kind of talking about how this is a problem for a lot of people. Why isn't the book about how this mode of like one for one justice, like you
Hmm.
you you be good and you'll get rewards, and that's how the world works? Isn't the whole book shown to disprove it? What happens at the
Hmm.
end? What do you make of it?
Yeah, like it's kind of like the difficulty about the end is also the reading flow almost is that
Hmm.
you're yeah like it's this whole climax, right? Especially like God's speech
Hmm.
and that and then it feels like it's ending, and then there's like just a few lines of saying exactly what you just said. So I tend to kind of ignore it almost a little bit, and but I know that is problematic, and indeed a possible interpretation, which I already shared earlier during this conversation, is the William Blake one. Is just to kind of say like, yes, Job is full of life, but it is a different kind of life. So
Yes,
at the start, you could see Job being concerned for the righteous acts of his children. It's kind
yes,
of like, oh, like I want them to do well, so I'm gonna make sacrifice for them. And yes, it is righteous, but it is not holy, perhaps. Like it's not it doesn't have this full sense of also appreciating God's beauty. And
yes,
you see that in that, slide 27, them all playing the music. And I think there's also a slight difference with the sheep. For instance, at the start the sheep are asleep, and at the end the sheep are awake. And again, I know this is a Blakean interpretation, but nonetheless, I think there's something to it that in the whole, like it's returned to him, but now with a new perspective. And the whole point would
mhm,
be, if I'm charitable to this interpretation, I'm not saying that it ruins it, would be like it's not just about the prosperity, because that would be very anti-Nietzschean indeed. Like,
yes,
oh, he gets everything back and that
yes,
was the reason. I do think it helps that it's after he gets the insight, so it's not
yes.
that he gets it and therefore Job is like, oh, well, I really bothered that you well, let me go through that, but now it's okay because I'm rewarded. Like he already had the insight before
Yes,
then,
and that's the
and
key
he's
thing.
able to, yeah, look at life in a new way. And I I'm trying to keep with the Blakean vision a little bit there. What do
I,
you
I,
think?
I would agree with that. He's able to enjoy life in a deeper way. Absolutely.
Yeah.
He's able to utilize what he has in a deeper and richer way. I also think that I don't actually think that I mean, okay, let me put it a different way. There clearly is a correlation between virtue and flourishing. Like
Hmm.
that's not actually, it's just that the correlation isn't perfect. That's the problem. But there clearly is a correlation between virtue and flourishing. And so that he starts out very virtuous and very flourishing shouldn't be in itself unusual or extraordinary.
I mean, for Aristotle, that would be bang
Exactly.
on.
Like,
That would,
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. But
yeah,
like that just it seems to be true. I mean, I'm sort of immersed in Jordan Peterson type thought
yeah.
about
I
this.
see.
But in my life and in my observation of life, it seems to be true that generally, but not always, but generally, there is that correlation that if you strive to be virtuous, you will be, in a sense, rewarded for it. But of course, you can't just be focused on getting rewards. That's part of the problem.
Mhm.
But anyway.
Yeah.
So the problem is that this isn't an absolute correlation, but it is a correlation. So it doesn't shock me as much to think that Job returns to that natural, general order
Hmm.
at the end of the story because he is good, and so it's natural that
Yeah.
he would be rewarded for that by nature. We're not talking about God just necessarily like individually dispensing things, but yeah.
Yeah. I see what you say. I see what you say. And I also think, I think it helps that this starts off with, um, God saying to the three friends that they
Mhm.
have to make sacrifices to Job. So
Mhm.
like
Yes.
says it's verse 8. Therefore, take upon you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. So there's also this sense
Hmm.
that Job, almost like in a from a noble perspective, is
Hmm.
already, let's say, a little bit higher up the hierarchy. So you can imagine that that will strongly correlate, let's say, with
Hmm.
his his wealth to
Hmm.
come. But yeah, I agree with you. I think the correlation is strong. This is, by the way, a problem in general. Like this is like a big thing in Plato's project was to try to argue that virtue is its own reward, and
Hmm.
actually it's disputed whether or not he succeeds in it.
Yes.
So I think it's worthwhile that this. I think it's also maybe this is just a perfect ambiguity of the story that people are debating whether or not it should be there.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So, but yeah, but I enjoy the fact that for most people it's not about this ending.
Yes.
But it also doesn't feel like, oh, it ruins it. It's not like, why
Yes.
is this ending there? Like, I
Yes.
don't have that at all. Like, it's like,
No.
no, as you said, like, you could sort of naturally expect it that this could happen, like,
Yes.
conceivably. So it's like an epilogue. It's not an ending. It's an epilogue. It's like, yeah. I thought
Um,
I mentioned that.
so
Good.
so to kind of round it out or to summarize, at least for me, reading through Job in this light, I I'm kind of convinced with what you said that Job is a bridge between a Nietzschean worldview and a Christian worldview. I really think that, yeah, I really
Hmm.
think that there's a lot that is Nietzschean in the book. And yet there's also that bridge with Christianity. There's a lot that is Christian in the book.
Hmm.
Not to
Also, the focus
mention
on the victim, by the way.
focus on the victim. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. To me, it's sort of, but I still have qualms, to be fair, with Christianity and with a sense of somehow everything has to be just and so on and so forth. But I think in the book of Job, at least, we see a picture where justice is of extreme value, where morality is of incredible value, not only for its own sake, but as a pathway toward God, even though it can't fully get us there, maybe, or
Hmm.
we have to let go of something in order to get there. And so you could say broadly, then maybe it bridges between like a immanent focused worldview and a transcendent focused worldview, or a religious worldview and a non-religious worldview, or something like that. But for me, that really feels like there's a connection. So that was really exciting for me. I wanted to make one quick clarification or expansion on what I've been talking about, because I've kind of been talking about God as being effectively beyond good and evil. But I want to clarify what I mean by that. So this goes back to the hemispheric asymmetry, the asymmetry we noted between Satan and God. Um, it's not, I wouldn't say that God is beyond good and evil, but I would say that God is the good with a capital G, that that transcends merely relative good versus evil, if that makes sense. So in other words, actually, I've got a quote from the Gilchrist here. Let me just quickly find it. Um, Here we go. The goodness of love can embrace its opposite, the evil of hate cannot. So it goes back to that idea. So God is the ultimate good. God is absolute good. And in that sense, God can embrace evil. That seems to be the message here, or at least to me, that seems to be the message here. So, what I'm not saying is that God is beyond good and evil in an amoral
Hmm.
sense that doesn't care about it. Why does God create the universe? Because it's good, like as Genesis says, and
Hmm.
because it enables human goods, but also just because it's good in itself. And so it's all
Hmm.
about goodness affirmation. Uh, it's just that that doesn't look, what would you say, legalistic, moralistic. It looks different on the ultimate level. So that those would be my concluding words. But Job is wonderful, beautiful. It's also confronting and terrible because Job gets this spiritual insight. He gets this, he's
Hmm.
rewarded in a sense by the vision of God and with real, true wisdom. But
Hmm.
he has to go through the trial. And, I want the
Yeah.
vision and I want the wisdom, but I definitely don't want to go through the trial. So,
Yeah. Beware of unearned wisdom. That's the
exactly.
Jungian thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and by the way, like I'm reminded as you were talking about the possible interpretation of the love thine enemy line,
Hmm.
which is like, you love in the largest sense, capital G, good,
Hmm.
sort of, but they are still your enemy. And that's sort of so you're keeping the good evil distinction sort of on the right level. But at the same time, on the whole, like you you make an active effort to love them. But
And
that's
and for the Christian
yeah.
viewers as well, like I would see this also in the way that Jesus stated the two great commandments: love the Lord
Hmm.
your God with all your mind, heart, soul, strength,
Yeah.
and love your neighbor as yourself. This seems to me
Yeah.
to be a parallel of wisdom is the fear of God, and understanding is to turn away from evil.
Hmm.
Loving God with all your being is affirming God
Hmm.
and creation, regardless of its apparent evil.
I
And
see.
loving your neighbor as yourself is discerning and discriminating between good and evil, pursuing the one and rejecting the other. And so
Hmm.
they're on different levels, but they're both necessary. And so again, when I sort of noticed that, I was like,
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah, and I think like it is a really good insight, and it allows and motivates us people living together with all the necessities that are part of that. So including,
Mhm.
let's say, the conflict, but also including the necessary harmonies.
Yeah.
Because if you would only emphasize, affirmation of the whole, you'd get this sense of, Maya illusion
Hmm.
and get outside of that. But now it's the sense like, no, actually, but you have to embrace the particular as
Hmm.
well. And even if that sometimes means, let's say, saying whoa to those particulars, and you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, so I really took that away from this conversation. And by the way, I didn't say that yet, but I very much enjoyed, like, it's kind of like an honor that, like, I just shared this idea because I had encountered it in Nietzsche that I was
Hmm.
interested in, which is indeed like the Job affirms, and then
Hmm.
how liberating is Dostoevsky. And we didn't even talk about the Dostoevsky part,
Hmm.
which is fine but we could at some point. But to kind of have you work out so much of it is really an honor because, like, there are points of this that I was like, yeah, I actually think there's something there, but I hadn't worked it out at all. So
Hmm.
to see you go through that work and then sort of bringing it together in this conversation has really been, yeah, quite the experience. So I thank you for that, like, very deeply.
Well, thank you for inspiring that and sort of being there with me to go through that and contributing to that as well. Um, so yeah, it's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure we'll have more in the future about similar things.
For me as well. Yeah, thank you. Really good.
Thanks, Aaron.
Wonderful.